Wayne's already said, good to see everybody in Sunday school today. Go ahead and tell you I've got two options. I can either leave my glasses on and see you, or I can take them off so I can read my Bible. So I'm going to take them off. I don't know why anybody would, but if you want to make a face, stick your tongue out or something at me today, today's your opportunity. Because I won't be able to see you if you do. I'm having some trouble with my eyes, so it's either see you or see my Bible. I'm going to choose to be able to read my Bible today. So we'd like to thank Doyle for teaching last week. Did a good job on the good hand of God. Taught last week. Thank him for that. It didn't give him a whole lot of notice, so I really thank him for that, taking care of that. Did a good job, as always. All right, we'll recap here what we talked about 2 weeks ago. Again, we were in Mark chapter number 8, and we had started looking at one of three special truths that Jesus shares with his disciples during this particular section, beginning in chapter 8, verse 27, going through chapter 9, verse 13, where he's teaching them that suffering leads to glory. And in verse 27 and 28, he wants a confession. Well, actually 27 through 30, he wants a confession from the disciples here. In verse 27 and 28 of chapter number 8, remember he asked them who other people thought that he was. Some told him John the Baptist, some said maybe Elijah, some said, or just one of the prophets. And Matthew talks about Jeremiah, and we talked about that one probably made the most sense because we looked at the comparison between Jeremiah the prophet and Jesus. Verse 29 and 30 of chapter number 8, Jesus then asked them, he says, but who do you say that I am? Of course, Peter being the spokesman of the group, he said, well, thou art the Christ. And Matthew adds, the Son of the living God. So Jesus got the confession from the apostles there. And then also, we looked at some confusion maybe from the apostles in verse 31 through 38. Verse 31, Jesus tells them what's going to happen to him once they get to Jerusalem. He says he's going to suffer, he's going to be rejected, he's going to die, but he's going to rise from the dead on the third day. Of course, Peter, verse 32, being the spokesperson again, he says, no way, Lord. He said, that's just not going to happen. We're not going to allow it. You are the prophesied Messiah. There's no way that they'll reject you. There's no way they're going to kill you. We're not going to let that happen. Verse 33, Jesus rebuked Peter as well as the other disciples, and he tells them that they're thinking more like men or more like Satan. He says, Satan desires to have you. They might sift you as wheat, and they're not thinking like God. So they want glory, but they don't want suffering. And that's what Jesus is trying to teach them, right the opposite. Verse number 34, Jesus tells them what true discipleship is. Remember, he says you got to deny yourself, you got to take up your cross, and you got to follow me. That's true discipleship. And in verse 35 through 37, he reminds them that they have an option. They can either invest their life or they can waste their life, but they need to remember, once they get to the end of their life, there's no way they can buy it back. What they've done is what they've done. There's no way they can go back and change it. And in verse 38, he reminds them there are consequences and are rewards for true discipleship. And he reminds them of that, verse 38. Then we got into chapter 9, and now we see confirmation by Jesus showing that he was God in the flesh by this transfiguration. Verse 1 through 3, we saw where he took Peter, James, and John. That was kind of the inner circle. He took them up to the mountain and was transfigured before them. Verse number 4, we saw where Moses and Elijah appeared with Jesus there on the mount. Moses, of course, representing the law, Elijah representing the prophets. We talked a little bit about how both were fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. Verse 5 and 6, Peter got all excited. He wanted to build 3 tabernacles, and that just showed, though, his human thinking rather than divine wisdom, because we all know you can't stay on the mountaintop forever, but that's kind of what Peter was thinking about. Verse number 7, we saw where God the Father intervened in the situation, and he said he was trying to take their focus off the vision of what they were seeing, and he wanted to get it more on what they were hearing. He says, this is my beloved Son. He said, I want you to hear him. So it's all about hearing the Word of God, not necessarily visions and dreams or anything like that, but the Word of God. So that got us down to chapter 9, verse number 8. So that's where we'll start today. Let me just back up and reread verses 1 through 10, and then we'll pick up back with verse number 8 here. Mark chapter 9, verse number 1, and he said unto them, verily I say unto you, that there be some of them that stand here which shall not taste death till they have seen the kingdom of God come with power. And after 6 days Jesus taketh with him Peter, James, and John, leadeth them up into an high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. Excuse me. And his raiment became shining, exceeding white as snow, so as no fuller on earth can white them. And there appeared unto them Elias and Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter answered and said unto Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. And let us make 3 tabernacles, one for thee, one for Moses, and one for Elias. For he wist not what to say, for they were sore afraid. And there was a cloud that overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud, saying, This is my beloved Son, hear him. And suddenly, when they had looked round about, they saw no man any more, save Jesus only, with themselves. And as they came down from the mountain, he charged them that they should tell no man what things they had seen, till the Son of Man were risen from the dead. And they kept that saying with themselves, questioning one with another what the rising from the dead should mean. So again, just rereading what we talked about last week, the story here on the Mount of Transfiguration. Back up to verse number 8. And suddenly, when they had looked round about, they saw no man any more, save Jesus only, with themselves. So I believe this verse here is just a reminder to them and to us today that we can't put any prophet, Moses, Elijah, or any prophet on the same level as Jesus. And that's kind of really what Peter was hinting. He said, let's make a tabernacle, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elias. But we see here, this verse says that Moses and Elijah were gone. It was Jesus only with him. So it's Jesus only. It's his word, it's his will, it's his kingdom, and it's his glory. But that's what that verse there is telling us. Verse number 9. And as they came down from the mountain, he charged them that they should tell no man what things they had seen till the Son of Man were risen from the dead. So he goes on to tell Peter, James, and John here. He says, I don't want you to tell anybody what has just happened, this experience. Not even the other 9 apostles that they would hear just in a few verses. They're going to actually meet back up with the other 9 apostles. Now, we're not told why Jesus told them not to tell anybody till he was risen from the dead. So Jesus didn't tell us. I'm not even going to speculate. That's just the way Jesus wanted to be here with these 3 apostles there. Verse number 10, he says, and they kept that saying with themselves, questioning one with another what the rising of the dead should mean. So they obeyed Jesus. They did exactly what he said. They didn't tell anybody else, but yet they still wondered what this rising from the dead should mean, because nobody, that hadn't happened to anybody. They didn't know exactly what he was talking about. Of course, we know later they actually witnessed it, and so they fully understood later. But at this time, they were still wondering what that would be. So here's this: we have the confirmation here in this particular passage about Jesus being God in the flesh. He was transfigured before him. Now in verses 11 through 13, we're going to see some correction here that Jesus had to give to the apostles here, or just the ones there that were with him. Let me read those verses, 11 through 13. And they asked him, saying, Why say the scribes that Elias must first come? And he answered and told them, Elias verily cometh first, and restoreth all things. And how it is written of the Son of Man, that he must suffer many things, and we said it not. But I say unto you that Elias is indeed come, and they have done unto him whatsoever they listed, as it is written of him. So verse number 11 here, Peter, James, and John, they asked Jesus, they said, why do the scribes say that Elijah first must come and prepare the way for the Messiah? I mean, the scribes knew the scriptures. The apostles here knew the scriptures. Malachi, it was prophesied, Malachi chapter 3 verse 1, Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant whom ye delight in. Behold, he shall come, saith the Lord of hosts. Malachi 4, verse 5 and 6, Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. So they knew the prophecies that Elijah he's going to come back. Elijah is going to come back. So maybe they were wondering, was this appearing here on the Mount of Transfiguration? Was it a fulfillment of this prophecy? Well, no, it was not. And Jesus goes on to explain that to them in verses 12 and 13. Of course, he explains to them that the spirit and power of Elijah had already came, and we know that was in the form of John the Baptist. Luke chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. And many of the children of Israel shall he turn to the Lord their God, and he shall go before him in the spirit and power of Elias, which of course we all know is Elijah, to turn the hearts of their fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. So he's telling them that Elijah is coming in the spirit and power. I mean, the spirit and power of Elijah is coming, but that's going to be in John the Baptist. And then he also reminds them, though, that there would also be another future coming of Elijah. Malachi predicted that. I read the verses there. Malachi 4, verse 5. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible, dreadful day of the Lord. Now, most Bible scholars believe that this will take place in Revelation chapter number 11. That Elijah is one of the two witnesses that will come and prophesy and preach before the time of the Great Tribulation. So Jesus here, he's just giving a little correction here to the disciples that this instance where Elijah appeared on the Mount of Transfiguration, that was not a fulfillment of the prophecies that we just talked about. So here in this section, we've seen here the first lesson that Jesus is teaching, that suffering leads to glory, and he's been telling them that you gotta, if you want glory, you first gotta suffer. Now the next lesson he's going to teach them in our section is found in chapter 9, verses 14 through 29. He's going to be teaching them that true power actually comes from faith. So let's read those verses here. Mark chapter 9. I'll read verses 14 through 29. And then we'll just come back and look at these verses individually. Mark 9:14, and when he came to his disciples, he saw a great multitude about them, and the scribes questioning with him. And straightway all the people, when they beheld him, were greatly amazed, and running to him saluted him. And he asked the scribes, What question ye with him? And one of the multitude answered and said, Master, I have brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit. And wheresoever he taketh him, he teareth him, and he foameth and gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth him. And I spake to thy disciples that they should cast him out, and they could not. And he answereth him and saith, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him to me. And they brought him unto him. And when he saw him, straightway the spirit tare him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming. And he asked his father, How long is it ago since this came unto him? And he said, Of a child. And ofttimes it hath cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Jesus said unto him, If thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. And straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. When Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the foul spirit, saying unto him, Thou dumb and deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him, and enter no more into him. And the spirit cried and rent him sore, and came out of him. And he was as one dead, insomuch that many said, He is dead. And Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he was come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, Why could we not cast him out? And he said unto them, This kind can come forth by nothing, but by prayer and fasting. So we see the story here of this young boy that was deaf and dumb, he was possessed with a demon here. Disciples could not cast him out, which we see Jesus here. So we see here Jesus is teaching them that power comes from faith. That's how you get true power. Back up to verse 14 through 16. When Jesus, of course, and Peter, James, and John, when they had came down from the Mount of Transfiguration, and they joined themselves together with the other 9 apostles, as well as some other people here in this crowd, they found these other 9 apostles having a debate, if you will, with the scribes here. So Jesus just simply asked them a question. He says, What question ye among them? Verse number 16 he says, What's going on? What are y'all talking about? What's the debate here? Now, verse 17 and 18, of course, we see one of the men proceeded to tell Jesus about his son. He says, I've got a son. He's deaf, dumb. He's demon possessed. And I brought him to your disciples, or these 9 apostles here that were still left. And he said, but they could not help him. They could not cast him out. Now, we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us, but it kind of speculate. Going back up to verses 14, 15, and 16, it could have been maybe these scribes may have been taunting these 9 apostles maybe because they couldn't do it. You know, they were saying, yeah, you know, your leader's gone, Jesus is gone, and now here you can't do this. You can't do anything. So they may have been taunting them. We don't know. Then verse 19, look at Jesus' response. And he answereth and said, O faithless generation, how shall I be with you? How long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him to me. So he was disappointed here with what was going on. He was disappointed with these other 9 apostles. And look what he said. He called them a faithless generation. He's just addressing their unbelief here once again. We've talked about that multiple times during our study of Mark, how that the disciples, just at various times, they just didn't have the faith that they needed. He said, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Which we know suffer here just means to bear with or to endure. He says, how long am I going to have to endure with you disciples because of your lack of faith? So we see verse number 20, what happens? And they brought him unto him, and when he saw him straightway, the spirit tear him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed foaming. So Jesus here saw firsthand exactly what was going on with this young boy, with this man's son, and what this demon was doing to him. Verse 21 and 22, Jesus asked the boy's father, he says, how long has this been going on with your son? And of course he goes on and tells him basically all his life. Verse 21, he says, and he said of a child. So just pretty much all his life these things were going on with his child, and he couldn't seem to get any help for his son here. In verse number 22, and oftentimes, just going on to tell what happened, and oftentimes it cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. So this demon would try to throw him into fire, maybe try to throw him into water, a pool of water or something, to try to destroy this boy. But notice what this man says here to Jesus, the last part of verse number 22. He says, but if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. So he's maybe even questioning. I'm sure he's heard what all Jesus has been able to do. He's heard about all the miracles that Jesus has been performing in his ministry. But yet now he's doubting maybe whether or not Jesus can even heal his son or help his son. Why? Probably because the other apostles, they couldn't do it. So, what we do as Christians today will affect what others think of Jesus and what others think of Christ. So we have to be careful today on what we do and how we act. So it could have been maybe why he was even wondering if Jesus could even heal him because of what had happened with the apostles. But notice what Jesus said, verse 23. And Jesus said, if thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believes. So he's just reminding the dad here. He says, if you believe, all things are possible to you. If you'll only just believe. If you only have faith. The disciples maybe haven't had the faith they needed, but if you'll have enough faith, he says all things are possible. In verse number 24 here, the man, he says he believes. He says, Lord, I believe. But he also goes on to say, Lord, help my unbelief. So the man here admits, he says, I've got some faith, but I don't know if I've got enough. He says, help my unbelief. And I don't know about you, but I find myself praying that prayer sometimes. Lord, help my unbelief. I like to think that I believe that God's going to do what he says he's going to do, but sometimes my faith is weak, and I have to pray that prayer, Lord, help my unbelief. I'm sure we all probably get there sometimes. So see what happens next, verse 25, verse number 26. And when Jesus saw the people come running together, he rebuked the foul spirit, saying, Thou dumb and deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him, and enter no more into him. The spirit cried, rent him sore, and came out of him, and as he was as one dead, insomuch that the people said, He is dead. So Jesus, he did exactly what he always does, right? There was a boy here that needed some help. Jesus showed compassion on him, and he helped him. He touched him. He cast out this demon, insomuch that some people even thought he was dead. That's what the last part of the verse said, verse 26. Some of the people said, well, he's dead now. What have you done to him? You've killed him now. But look what Jesus did, verse 27. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. So Jesus lifted him up just to show to the crowd, no, he's not dead. He's just as normal now as anybody else, as you and me and anybody else. So he showed the crowd here that he had performed this miracle, and now that this young boy, he was fine now. We'll see what happened next, verse number 28. And when he was coming to the house, his disciples asked him privately, why could we not cast him out? So the disciples got Jesus, they got him alone. They got him out of the crowd. They went into the house, and it said they were in private there. The disciples asked him privately. They said, why could we not do this miracle? Why were we not able to cast this demon out of this young boy? Because now remember, Jesus had granted him that power. Remember back in Mark chapter number 6, verse 7, when he first sent the 12 out, and he called unto him the 12 and began to send them forth two by two and gave them power over unclean spirits. And we know where they had actually done it in the past. They came back, and told Jesus what all they had been able to do, how they had been able to cast out devils and things like that. So, but look at Jesus' answer here. He gives them, verse 29. He said to them, this kind can come forth by nothing, but by prayer and fasting. So he says you got to have prayer and you got to fast. You got to have faith. So, who knows? Maybe these 9 apostles. Now remember, they were just 9 here because Peter, James, and John, they were with him on the Mount of Transfiguration. So it was just the 9 here at this time. And who knows? Maybe with the fact that Jesus had been gone for a little while, we don't know how long they were gone on the Mount of Transfiguration. The Bible doesn't tell us, but they may have got lax, maybe in their spiritual discipline, maybe in their devotion. They may have got lax while Jesus was gone, and it caused their faith to get weak. That happens to us today. If we get lax in our discipline, if we get lax in our devotion, it causes us to get weak as well, and we can't do the things that we could. We all get there, at some point in our lives. We've all been there. So Jesus said you got to have prayer, but he also says you got to have fasting. And that seems to be a lost art these days. You don't hear of a whole lot of people, because you're not supposed to hear. I don't know, maybe a lot of people fasting because that's the way it's supposed to work, right? You're not supposed to tell people when you do that kind of stuff. Jesus was clear about that. So there may be a lot of people fasting we just don't know about. But it just seems you don't hear a lot taught or preached in these days about fasting. Now I know I work with some Catholic people. Everybody's probably acquainted with them. They have Lent, in the spring around Easter time, and they go 30 days, and they'll give up something they really, really like. They'll give it up. I know one of my supervisors several years ago, he loved chocolate, and he would give up chocolate every Lent, for 30 days. He wouldn't eat any chocolate. And I guess that's kind of what fasting is. It's giving up something that you really like, sacrificing something, and that's okay to do that, and we probably would do us all good to do that sometimes if we would just lay something down, especially maybe a cell phone or something. So lay it down for a while so we can get closer to the Lord. But I personally believe when the Bible's talking about fasting, I think it's talking about eating. Because that's what Jesus talks about when he talks about fasting. When they fasted in the Old Testament, that's what they did, right? They just didn't eat. And so I believe that's what it's talking about. So it all do us good maybe to get back to that, not only pray, but if we're really, really wanting something done, just try to fast on it for a while and see if that'll help. Because that's what Jesus said. He said, this is why you guys couldn't do it. He said, because it's got to be by prayer and it's got to be by fasting. So here's the second lesson we've looked at that Jesus is teaching. Remember, he talked about how suffering leads to glory, and we just talked about here how power comes from faith, and he's teaching that here to his apostles. But then the third lesson here that he's teaching was found in the rest of chapter number 9, verses 30 through 50, and he's going to teach them that service leads to honor. Remember, Jesus is the servant. Mark presents Jesus as the servant. And he's going to remind them that true service leads to honor. So let's read these verses. Mark 9 verses. I'll just read 30 through 50, the rest of the chapter. And then we'll go back and look at some of these verses and see what Jesus is teaching here to his disciples. Mark 9 verse 30, and they departed thence and passed through Galilee, and he would not that any man should know it. And he taught his disciples and said unto them, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of men, and they shall kill him. And after that he is killed, he shall rise the third day. But they understood not that saying, and were afraid to ask him. And he came to Capernaum, and being in the house, he asked them, what was it that ye disputed among yourselves by the way? But they held their peace, for by the way they had disputed among themselves, who should be the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12, and saith unto them, if any man desire to be first, the same shall be last of all, and servant of all. And he took a child, and set him in the midst of them. And when he had taken him in his arms, he said unto him, whosoever shall receive one of such children in my name receiveth me, and whosoever shall receive me receiveth not me, but him that sent me. And John answered him, saying, Master, we saw one casting out devils in thy name, and he followeth not us, and we forbade him, because he followeth not us. But Jesus said, forbid him not, for there is no man which shall do a miracle in my name that can lightly speak evil of me. For he that is not against us is on our part. For whosoever shall give you a cup of water to drink in my name, because ye belong to Christ, verily I say unto you, he shall not lose his reward. And whosoever shall offend one of these little ones that believe in me, it is better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and he were cast into the sea. And if thy hand offend thee, cut it off. It is better for thee to enter into life maimed than having two hands, to go into hell, into the fire that never shall be quenched, where their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched. And if thy foot offend thee, cut it off. It is better for thee to enter halt into life than having 2 feet, to be cast into hell, into the fire that never shall be quenched, where their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched. And if thy eye offend thee, pluck it out. It is better for thee to go into the kingdom of God with one eye than having 2 eyes, to be cast into hell fire, where their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched. For every one shall be salted with fire, and every sacrifice shall be salted with salt. Salt is good, but the salt hath lost its saltness. Wherewith will ye season it? Have salt in yourselves, and have peace one with another. So in this particular section here, again, Jesus is teaching them that how service leads to honor. Back up. Let's go back to verse number 30. And they departed thence and passed through Galilee, and he should not that any man should know it. So they were continuing their journey on through the region of Galilee. And of course, their ultimate destination, we know Jesus' ultimate destination was Jerusalem. But once again here, Jesus didn't want anybody to know it. Again, he just, for whatever reason, he didn't want a lot of the publicity. So he said he didn't want any man know that they were passing through this particular area. Verse 31, for he taught his disciples and said, the Son of Man is delivered to the hands of men, and they shall kill him, and after he is killed shall rise the third day. So he's continuing to tell his disciples, or to teach his disciples, what's ultimately going to happen to him once they reach Jerusalem. He reminds them once again. He's already told them once, but he tells them again. He says, I'm going to have to suffer. And he said, I'm going to have to die. He said, but I am going to rise again the third day. So because Jesus kept telling the disciples this, and again, they didn't want to hear it, and they really didn't fully understand it, but Jesus kept telling them this. So I'm sure the disciples were thinking, well, you know, if that's going to happen when you get to Jerusalem, just don't go there. I mean, was it Brother Jenkins used to talk about? Was it his dad or his grandfather? He's told us several times. He said, if I knew where I was going to die, I just wouldn't go there. And so that's what these disciples were probably thinking. He says, well, let's just don't go there, so this won't happen. We don't want you to die. We don't want you to have to suffer. Because in verse 32, they just didn't understand, but they understood not that saying, and were afraid to ask him. So they just still didn't fully understand, because they knew he was the prophesied Messiah. He had already told them. Right. So why would the Messiah that the Old Testament prophets prophesied was going to come, why would he be rejected? And Matthew gives a little more detail. Matthew 17, verse 22 and 23, and when they abode in Galilee, Jesus said unto them, the Son of Man shall be betrayed into the hands of men, and they shall kill him, and the third day he shall be raised again. And they were exceeding sorry. And that means they were deeply grieved, because Jesus kept telling them that he's going to have to suffer and that he's going to have to die. Okay, verse 33, and they continued on the journey, and he came to Capernaum, and being in the house, he asked him, what was it that ye disputed among yourselves by the way? So they came to this house here in Capernaum. We don't know whose house. There's speculation. It may have been Peter's, because remember back in Mark chapter 1, they were in Capernaum. They went to Peter's house, and Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law that was sick. And then also in the next chapter, Mark chapter number 2, where it talks about it was noised that he was in the house, and that's where they broke the roof apart and let the man down. And they could have been back at Peter's house. We don't know, but they were in the house. And Jesus asked the question, what is it that you disputed among yourselves by the way? And I mean, Jesus knew what they were disputing about, because he knew their thoughts, and just like he knows ours today. But he was going to give them a chance to answer that question. Right. Verse 34, but they held their peace, for by the way they had disputed among themselves who should be the greatest. So they were actually ashamed to answer this question, because they knew they shouldn't have been doing that. They shouldn't have been disputing who was going to be the greatest. Now, I mean, we don't know. It could be maybe the fact that Peter, James, and John had been alone with Jesus, remember, for a while on the Mount of Transfiguration, that maybe added some fuel to the fire of competition. You know how it is. It's human nature for us to have a competitive spirit most of the time in it. Well, the apostles were probably doing the same thing, and they said, well, he took Peter, James, and John with him, so they must be the favorites. We want to know who's going to be the greatest. So that may be why they started the dispute. We don't know, but either way, they were grieved. We just talked about that, how they were grieved because Jesus said, I'm going to have to die, but they weren't grieved enough to not have this dispute and to not have this conversation, though. So verse 35, and he sat down and called, this was Jesus' response. He sat down and called the 12 and saith unto them, if any man desire to be first, the same shall be last of all and servant of all. So again, he knew their thoughts. They didn't tell him what they were talking about, what they were disputing about, but he knew already. And so he told them here. He just gave them this simple answer, pretty easy to understand who's going to be the greatest. He says, if you want to be the greatest, or if you want to be the first, then you've got to be the servant. You got to choose to be last, which means you got to choose to be the servant. And that's what it's all about. It's all about serving others. Jesus, of course, the ultimate example. I already mentioned a while ago, Mark presents Jesus as the servant, the ultimate servant. So it's all about serving others, and it's a simple answer here that Jesus gave them. He said, who's going to be the servant? That's the one that's going to be the greatest. So we'll stop here. Lord willing, next week we'll take back up verse number 36 and continue seeing how Jesus is teaching them here that service leads to honor. If you want honor, you need to be a servant. So chapter 9, verse 36, we'll take up next week.